Good morning, everybody on the East Coast, and good evening, everyone in South Korea. Hello and welcome to today's program, Korea's Presidential Election, Impact and Forecast Analysis. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Tom Byrne, and I'm the President and CEO of the Korea Society. Before we get started, I would like to thank the Korea Foundation and our corporate sponsors for making this program possible. In just a couple of days on March 9th, South Korea will hold another democratic presidential election. Just a few short years ago, it seems, Korea made global headlines by conducting its midterm election in the height of the pandemic, proving the persistence and rigor of the country's institutions, and also resilience to such a challenge. Now the election will be held, and there's a lot going on in the background. Omicron cases are spiking at unexpectedly high levels in South Korea. And the National Election Commission, however, will allow persons infected or in quarantine to put their votes directly into ballot boxes themselves. Property prices remain sky high in South Korea, pushing housing out of reach for many younger people. And outside of South Korea, North Korea conducted another ballistic missile launch. And of course, the big shadow hanging over everything today is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues to grind on. Markets are being shaken, and so is global trade and investment. So we have a lot to cover today, but we have an extremely capable panel that is more than equal to the challenges. Our four panelists bring deep expertise and experience. It's my pleasure to introduce them. First, we have Michelle Lee, Seoul Tokyo Bureau Chief of the Washington Post. Previously, she was a reporter for the Post's fact checker and a government accountability reporter at the Arizona Republic in Phoenix, Arizona. She is currently serving her second term as the president of the Asian American Journalists Association. Thanks for joining us, Michelle. Second, we have Karl Friedhoff, the Marshall M. Bouton Fellow for Asian Studies at the Chicago Council. Previously, he was a Korea Foundation, Mansfield Foundation, U.S. Korea Nexus Scholar, a member of the Mansfield Foundation's Trilateral Working Group, and a program officer in the Public Opinion Studies program at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Great to have you with us, Karl. Third, joining in from Seoul, we have Jeongmin Kim, the Seoul correspondent at NK News. Prior to joining NK News, she worked at Reuters Seoul Bureau and CSIS Korea Chair in Washington, D.C. Her writings on both Koreas appeared in Foreign Policy, the Asia Society, and the National Interest, and has been a regular guest on TV and radio to discuss North Korea. Welcome, Jeongmin. And last but not least, we have Dr. Katrin Katz, who is the Korea Society's Van Fleet Nonresident Senior Fellow, the first person to fill such a position. Dr. Katz is a former director for Japan, Korea, and Oceanic Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council, where she served from 2007 to 2008. She was previously an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Columbia University and has also taught at Georgetown University. Thanks for joining us, Katrin. The moderator for today's program is Korea Society's Policy Director, Jonathan Corrado. And now the floor is yours, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks to all of our virtual audience for joining us today. We are taking your questions live, so you could send them in now and throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. We've already received a bunch of great ones, and we have time saved at the end to convey them, and I might pepper them throughout the program. For the first question, we got a question from Rob Donaldson, who asked us to just briefly explain who the major candidates are and where their parties align on the political spectrum. I thought this would be some good quick table setting to do before we got into the conversation proper. So on the conservative side, we have former Chief Prosecutor Yoon Suk-yeol representing the People Power Party in a development that could affect the outcome of the election. Last week, he was backed by minority party candidate Ahn Cheol-soo of the People Party. And on the progressive side, we have former Gyeonggi Province Governor Lee Jae-myung representing the ruling Democratic Party. And finally, we have Shim Sung-jung of the Justice Party. And with that stated, I just want to set a little bit up in terms of what's going on right now. On Monday, we saw the two remaining candidates travel to the strong base of their opponents. So Lee went to Jeju, Busan, and Daegu, and Yoon went to Gyeonggi-do. This is their final effort to poll voters as the campaign winds to a close. Over a third of voters have already participated in early voting. Okay, so with all that laid out, it's time to get into the discussion. And Michelle, the first question is going to go to you. I'm hoping that we could start with just sort of a big picture framing of the election. And the timing is good because you just came out with an article this morning, just actually a couple minutes ago, about this very topic. And, you know, just looking back, for those of us who follow this, this has been a close race, very heated, changing leads, mergers, scandals, twists and turns. You talked about, in one of your previous articles, quote, the downsides of a personality-led election and its impact on public trust, end quote. When we look back at this election in hindsight, what is it going to be remembered for? What are the key storylines that have sort of affected the trajectory of this election?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here and looking forward to this discussion. To get to your question, you know, the trajectory of this election, it truly has been this unpredictable journey of twists and turns, right? There have been scandals after scandals, insults, bickering, mudslinging. I mean, we know that South Korean politics is a bloodbath, but this feels like it's been on a new level. And they have become deeply unlikable candidates as a result. This election has been called the 역대 비호감 대선, or the unprecedented election of the unlikables, because of the sheer amount of negativity, the mudslinging campaigning, the scandals involving not just the candidates, but also their family members, in-laws, children, you know, spouses. And I think it will be remembered for this tenor, maybe even for some of the most absurd moments, like Yoon Suk-yeol's ties to an anal acupuncturist, or maybe Lee Jae-myung's proposal to give government-funded hair plugs for bald men. But I also wanted to pull back and set the scene some more for this upcoming discussion about three main things that I'm thinking about in these final days before the election. First is just what you mentioned, the impact of this election's tenor on public trust in government, especially during a time of deep frustration and eroding public trust because of the soaring real estate prices and the failure of the Moon government to curb real estate speculation. You're already seeing a lot of public distrust in institutions, frustration over income inequality and class disparities, and this growing sense of cynicism toward people in power and feeling like they're hypocrites. I keep thinking about this term 내로남불, which means if I do it, it's romance. If others do it, it's an extramarital affair. This sense that people are being hypocritical about their standards on what's acceptable. And if this election turns out to be as tight as we think it's going to be, then that means whoever wins, the new president will have half a country that detests him and the other half that only voted for him because they thought the other guy was worse, which I think is going to be a big test of leadership for the incoming president. The second is turnout, which you already mentioned. I'm really interested to see the turnout from this election. I think just a few weeks ago, I was asking Karl what he thought the turnout was going to be, because I thought maybe because the candidates were so unlikable, people wouldn't come. But early voter turnout from this weekend has been record-setting. We've had more than 16 million people turn out, which is more than a third of the total electorate. We've been talking to early voters at the sites the past couple of days, and we've been struck by how many people said that they wanted to vote because they knew it was going to be a close election. They wanted to be heard, and they also did not want the guy they dislike more to win. So that's really moved them to come out and vote in droves, and I'm really interested to see whether this really sets a new level of engagement. Of course, there are a lot of COVID concerns, so people came out early because they wanted to avoid crowds on Wednesday, but I think there might be something to be said about the turnout and enthusiasm despite, or maybe because of this unlikable candidacy. And the last bucket is of course foreign policy. I know we'll get into this more, but the key storyline of this election is what might be the implications of foreign policy if the government flips, especially. And I think there will be big implications if Yoon becomes president, especially on South Korea's relationships with North Korea, China, and Japan, and the US. I think the Lee victory will be more or less a continuation of the current government, maybe slight changes in style, but not much substantively. But Yoon, with harder line on North Korea, harsher in some ways rhetoric toward China, and wants to improve relations with Japan. And I think those are going to be major themes that we will be watching and looking forward to, especially with the South Korean government South Korean public leaning so anti-China nowadays, and with the power with the leadership in Japan right now, with Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who's probably going to be the most likely partner if anybody from South Korean government does want to improve relations with Japan, given his key role in reaching the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement. So certainly on the foreign policy, I think we have many themes that are going to be driving this election and the government moving forward. So those are some of the big thoughts I have, and I know we have a lot to get to, so I'll stop here.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That's perfect. Great scene setter for us and those three key dynamics that are driving this process forward. And yeah, on the foreign policy, it's ironic that in this South Korea's election and in a lot of democracies, voters aren't strongly prioritizing foreign policy when they go to the polls. And yet, this is one of the biggest impacts that it has in the transition of governments. We see a very different posture in terms of foreign policy. So that'll be very interesting to see. And you did a great job setting up Karl, who's going to be our next speaker. So Karl, over to you, because you've been doing a fantastic job, not only providing the latest Korean polling figures on a real-time basis, but also explaining the context and the nuance between the different polls. And we can't just read them at face value, right? There's a lot to unpack here. So here we are, just a day or two away from the election. What are the poll numbers telling us? Any special insights from the polls about which issues are the ones that are the most important to the voters?
So I'll handle that first by going over the polling, and then I'll talk about the issues second. And I should also say thank you, Jonathan and Korea Society, for hosting this and for the invitation. So I'll make 3 points on the polling. And the first is that at the moment we're flying blind. So Korea has a law in place that from 7 days out from the election, no new polling can be released. So any of the polling we're going to talk about is either from March 2nd, March 1st, or before that. Some of the firms are still obviously doing polling. They just can't release it. So anything that we are discussing in terms of the race comes from almost a week ago at this point. And so we've missed some of the major events. For example, the fairly significant event of the An Chol-soo merger with Yoon Suk-yeol and him throwing his support behind Yoon. That's not captured in the polls. However, if we want to get into that during a Q&A session, I can break down how I would expect the An supporters to break out. It's not fully gonna go behind you. There's gonna be some diversification in votes there. It's unclear how much of an impact that will actually have. But in the last polling that we do have, and I think the most reliable polling is from the National Barometer Survey and from Gallup Korea. I'll talk about why I think that's the most reliable in a moment. It shows as a dead even race, and it's been that way for quite some time. I think the last I saw was 38-39, 37-37, so within a point or basically tied. And that leads into the second point on the polling, is that Yoon has been leading in virtually all of the polls ahead of the moratorium. Now, in some of these, it was, again, a point or two. In others, it was something more like 8 or 9 points. So Yoon, I think, has the advantage, and that includes, of course, the An merger may give him a small bump, probably not as significant as everyone is expecting. But I do think that Lee could still manage a close victory, especially as Michelle pointed out, turnout is looking very high. I tend to think that is going to favor Lee Jae-myung, just because a lot of anecdotal evidence suggested that it was going to be a lot of progressives who didn't, or were saying for the first time in their lives, they were considering not voting. And so if there's high turnout, I suspect that could push Lee a little bit closer. But that also leads to the third point, in that this is something I've been following for a little while. There's a little bit of chatter about it. I think that there's a significant chance of an election fraud narrative if Lee Jae-myung were to win. And this circles back to the polling tie-in. And the reason I think this is because, when you look at some of these polls, it's very easy to paint a narrative of Yoon Suk-yeol with a very large lead. And I think a lot of the conservatives have bought into that. You are going to see this if Lee Jae-myung ends up winning, that they're going to point back to that. I've seen some of the emails from some of the right-wing conspiracy theorists who are already pushing this election fraud narrative. And they're saying, yes, how is it possible that Lee can win? And the only way he can win is if there's election fraud and if China gets involved to help, stuff the ballot boxes or gets involved in some other way. So yeah, that polling, the divergent on methodology, where if you have the live interviews, which is how the National Barometer Survey does it, which is how Gallup Korea does it, and several others, they do live interviews with an actual interviewer. those polls actually come out very close, always within the margin of error, and been like that for quite some time. But these automated response surveys, where you just get a recording perhaps, or you have to touch something on the keypad to answer, those are producing polls that look like Yoon +8, +9. And I think those are highly misleading. So yeah, it's not just the election itself, but what comes immediately after. We should also keep an eye on. Now, for the issues that are important to voters, and it's not going to be a surprise for people who've been following this, it's real estate and economic growth in some mix. Generally, it depends on how they're asked in the survey, depends on what the mix of items is, but those two are always basically numbers 1 and number 2. And I'm sure there are people who are curious about where North Korea is going to rank in this, and it's a distant third. So for example, if you have real estate coming at 50%, which I've seen in some polls, economic growth may come in a little bit behind that. North Korea might be 10% of people saying that this is the biggest challenge and should be the priority for any incoming president. Now, of course, the question is also going to be, what about the recent missile launches? Well, we had, a record-breaking month in January. Still, nobody cared about North Korea. So I really think that these more recent tests in February also not going to move the dial for voters in terms of pushing them one way or the other on a candidate. And, it's been several weeks now where in the polling, about 90% of the public has said that they now back a candidate and they don't intend to switch their support. So voters are mostly locked in at this point. So that coupled with, the kind of blasé attitude about North Korean missile launches here in Korea it's just not going to push anything anywhere. But the bigger question is, do the issues even matter? And, if you followed Michelle's reporting on this, she had a great story on kind of how substance-free the campaign has been. And the answer seems to be, yeah, the issues maybe they don't matter in this election. We look at the National Barometer survey. They've been doing great polling on this. And they ask, why you're supporting a certain candidate. So 20% of Lee supporters cite policy as a reason for their support. But 44% cite his leadership ability. The numbers are much worse for Yoon. Yoon, 9% cared about policy, and 69% said they just supported him because they wanted a change in government from the current ruling party to the opposition party. So not even the voters are really out there pushing for substance. Instead, they have other reasons that they're supporting these candidates. Now, if there is one surprise, I somewhat think that it comes on polarization. The fact that there's broad recognition that Korea is highly polarized. We see this throughout the polling in terms of support numbers for either candidate, also for Moon Jae-in, but it's not really on the voters' radar. Right? Very few people are out there, at least in the survey data, saying that they want either candidate to address polarization or to heal society. No one puts a high priority on that. And for me, I think that that's somewhat concerning that, we're not seeing calls for national unity, but instead we're seeing more calls to punish opponents. And, that now with kind of the newly high-powered corruption investigation unit that's been established, I think there are already reports that the loser of the election will be arrested. That everyone's kind of, I know that's kind of the joke going around, although it probably is not a joke, that they are involved in significant scandals, either them or their family members, that it could be quite an acrimonious picture, and maybe right after the election, but then also in the first 2 years, as whoever the candidate is doesn't make any attempt to really try to heal the rifts.
Fascinating, so interesting, Karl. Thank you very much for that. And related to the accusations, the possible accusations of fraud, we did get a question from one of our audience members, Ashton Orms from the U.S. Army, retired, who asked, have there been any problems with early ballot voting irregularities? So we've seen a very high early voting turnout. I haven't seen any reports of irregularities. Just a quick glance at our panel to see if any reports of that. Not really. I'm seeing nods that we haven't really seen reports of that. Okay.
Like COVID voters, there was some issue with that over the weekend of people who are infected with COVID and are allowed to vote. They were waiting in lines for an hour or longer, sometimes in the cold, and some people were fainting. So there were concerns with that. So they're going to need to address Wednesday.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah, I know they gave them a special time, the COVID voters, after the people who do have COVID vote after everybody else, so they don't infect healthy people. But yes, it's still a lot more to work through. Okay, so now Jeongmin, over to you. Thank you so much for waiting patiently. And you've been doing a great job analyzing how this election is going to impact inter-Korean relations and, of course, U.S. Korea alliance coordination on North Korea policy. Can you give us your read for how a Lee versus a Yoon administration would deal differently with North Korea?
Their philosophies on inter-Korean relations, how they view North Korea, how they see how denuclearization may work, it differs a lot. So depends on who becomes a leader. South Korea's policy towards North Korea or coordination with the United States will change a lot. And I just wanted to mention first that although just following up to Karl's remark earlier, North Korea is not one of the things that South Korean voters focus on when they are casting their vote. It's not their primary concern. Although many people care about it, they don't change their votes just because of North Korea many times. But from the perspective of the candidates, North Korea is actually a very good peg for them to show off their leadership and show their usual supporters what kind of policies they have and what kind of charismatic leadership that they will show. And for Lee and Yoon, the North Korea peg actually worked very well for them to become a peg for them to show their defense policies and where they stand between the United States and China. And Karl mentioned that many of the Lee supporters supports Lee because of the policy, and Yoon supporters support Yoon because they want the change in the administration. And North Korea policy is actually a perfect peg for them to mention when they want to build this support, because Lee, most of the North Korea related policies he is inheriting from the Moon administration, although he is showing off a little bit more of a charismatic leadership, saying stuff like how he will say things at North Korea when it's needed, like provocations. While Yoon, the line of argument that he was giving on North Korea policy was that any North Korea policies that Moon administration went for was wrong. So with this bigger picture, let me just go into some of the main topics that were discussed during the election. First of all, they have a very different view on the denuclearization roadmap. So it will be a very different 5 years, depends on who wins. Lee wants a snapback sort of measure when it comes to denuclearizing North Korea. He is inheriting this idea of a step-by-step approach towards giving partial sanctions relief reward to North Korea's progress in denuclearization, but snap it back on when North Korea breaks a promise. So this is based on the idea of building trust with North Korea first and being open to dialogue. So this means that Lee will need North Korea to come back to the negotiation table. So he is not giving up on this idea of end of war declaration that Moon administration has been going for. So he is agreeing with the idea that the end of war declaration can become a great way, a segue into denuclearization or entrance into denuclearization. Yoon disagrees, and this comes from a very different philosophy looking at how denuclearization may work. Yoon thinks that North Korea is not willing to denuclearize and that international community should use pressure and sanctions against North Korea to push Pyongyang to the point where they start to think that they really need to denuclearize to survive. So Yoon, although he is also open to some sort of step-by-step approach, he has quote unquote principles. He thinks that South Korea should have a very clear parameter on the denuclearization process and the rewards as well. And from this, Yoon has this idea that end of war declaration is too premature right now because North Korea has not denuclearized and has not shown sincere willingness towards denuclearization. And he thinks that a premature end of war declaration is dangerous because North Korea will be coming up with follow-up demands to South Korea, such as sanctions relief or something about UNC as well, perhaps. But Yoon is not against the idea of peace treaties, so he is open to this idea of coexistence with North Korea and some form of unification or coexistence, but it's conditional and it's not a priority. He thinks that any peace treaty, it should come after North Korea denuclearizes. And from all these differences, it shows a difference in their defense policies and their difference in the tone of their remarks as well. We can see from Yoon's remark that he is very hawkish when he is mentioning North Korea. He's not afraid to talk about preemptive strikes, kill chains, a three-pillar system, reinstalling or deploying more THAAD batteries, and saying that Kim Jong-un has an attitude that he wants to fix. But Lee Jae-myung, he is more cautious. He does not think that preemptive strike is something that a president should say, but rather something a military commander should say. So he is more into this idea of a dialogue and diplomacy rather than scaring North Korea, which Yoon Suk-yeol sees as how deterrence works, showing that South Korea is militarily powerful. And because of all these differences, they have a bit of a different view on how U.S. extended deterrence may also work. There was some back and forth on how Yoon sees the redeployment of nuclear weapons in South Korea. Initially, he included that into the policy pledge, but it was a conditional sentence saying that in case there's emergency and there's not enough guarantee, but Yoon afterwards deleted that, and now he is against the idea of redeployment at all, saying that it's against NPT. So he's now sort of going for the international norm when he's driving policy when it comes to North Korea. But Lee Jae-myung, he is also not a fan of redeploying nuclear weapons, but he is going for developing nuclear-powered submarines. So for non-proliferation folks, when we hear nuclear-powered submarines, we think of all these complications, the proliferation issues, and whether or not the United States will agree. But from general South Korean public, when they hear nuclear, they hear power. So Lee Jae-myung is going for this angle where he sees, it seems like he saw that a lot of polls show that South Koreans are for nuclear submarines. And when I asked him, why do you think nuclear submarine is something South Koreans want? And do you think it's possible? He said that he can definitely do it when he talks to the United States and persuades Washington. But I'm not sure if Washington will be willing to say yes to that. So we can see that there are potential points of conflict on whether or not, depending on who wins in South Korea. And just to wrap up, they have a very different way of just framing North Korea in their remarks. Yoon Suk-yeol, during his campaign, used his social media with a very direct tone of anti-communism. In his reels and shorts and Facebook posts, he said "멸공," which is annihilate communism. Later on, he dithered away from explaining what he meant, but he is not afraid to say that North Korea is the main enemy. Lee Jae-myung is not. Lee Jae-myung is more cautious when he's approaching these issues, very similar to the Moon administration.
Thank you so much, Jeongmin. That was a fantastic job just in terms of giving us a sense for where they're sitting, where they're going, because even though it's largely party line in terms of Lee as a progressive inheriting these Moon administration policy platforms and Yoon tending to go towards the more traditional conservative platforms, we're facing a very different world here. And with the AUKUS deal, with the invasion of Ukraine, with the changing polling numbers on how Koreans look at China, for instance, we're going to see those things go in new and different trajectories. So that's so helpful. And also a great framer for our next panel speaker, which is Katrin Katz, our inaugural Van Fleet non-resident fellow. Katrin, thank you so much for joining us today. And over to you for some bigger picture foreign policy stuff. As we've discussed, Lee and Yoon have differences not only in terms of how they're going to approach North Korea, but also how they look at the world writ large, and China in particular, and the alliance as well. We also got a question from Ronald Fraser from the Department of National Defense of Canada about OPCON transfer. So just if you have any thoughts on OPCON transfer, how the next administration might look on that. And with that, over to you, Katrin.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and to Tom as well for your warm welcome. I'm so honored to be here today with Michelle, Jeongmin, and Karl talking about this very important and unusual election. So many great points have been made already by the other panelists. We've started a conversation on some foreign policy issues. So I'll put a little meat on the bones of some of those points, and then look forward to kind of moving forward and hearing more questions from the audience. So three brief points. One, we've talked a bit about the differences. I think it's also important to note up front that there are a number of similarities between the candidates. Most significantly, both candidates support a strong U.S.-South Korea alliance. Lee Jae-myung has referred to that alliance as a linchpin for peace and stability in the region and endorsed the May 2021 U.S. ROK joint statement that, of course, was released when President Moon visited President Biden in Washington, D.C. Last May, which laid out a comprehensive vision for the alliance with a number of areas beyond security for the countries to deepen cooperation. So in some ways, as much as these candidates differ on foreign policy, Yoon Suk-yeol has sounded pretty similar to Lee in saying things like, and this is a quote, Seoul should seek a comprehensive strategic alliance with Washington, and that one that will adapt to the needs of the 21st century. So this degree of similarity really should not be surprising to the audience and to us Korea watchers around the world. The alliance, as we all know, has been and remains South Korea's best means to manage enduring security challenges stemming from both North Korea's unpredictability and China's rise. In partnering with this distant power, the United States, with no territorial ambitions of its own, has been and remains a beneficial arrangement for both Seoul and Washington for the past 7+ decades. So the alliance continues to also enjoy a solid foundation of support within South Korea. And for this reason, the candidates would not likely win any votes or do well if they were to stray from this general position. So that's an important similarity, I think, to keep in mind in terms of continuity. I think for all of us on this panel and hopefully in the audience, one that is reassuring. Perhaps not everyone, but I think I'm speaking, probably for those of us on the panel. There are also some important differences, though, in the policy positions, as has been mentioned by the other panelists, laid out by Yoon and Lee, particularly in relation to China and Japan. To paint with broad brushstrokes, Lee has really defended Moon's policies that have, particularly those that have sought to avoid clearly taking sides in the growing U.S.-China strategic rivalry, with a premium placed on not antagonizing China. On Japan, Lee supports the two-track approach endorsed by Moon, which of course involves separating historical issues from other matters of shared interest. But Lee, like Moon, has insisted that the improvement of relations will be dependent on Japan first sincerely addressing historical issues. Even mentioning things like the Dokdo stance on Dokdo must be resolved. It's a pretty high bar to clear as a first step in moving forward with a two-track approach. Yoon, on the other hand, views close alignment with the United States as optimal. So if we see Moon and Lee is kind of focusing more on a relatively autonomous positions for Korea in the region, Yoon is really placing high value on alignment. Yoon has criticized Moon's, to kind of echo Jeongmin's points on the North Korea policy. Yoon has strongly criticized the Moon administration's approach of so-called strategic ambiguity toward China, claiming that it created the impression that Seoul was tilting toward China and away from the United States. Yoon has also been more forward-leaning in his support for US-led initiatives in the region like the Quad. On Japan, Yoon has also blamed Moon, perhaps not surprisingly, there's a pattern here, for the breakdown in relations between Seoul and Tokyo in recent years, and has committed to engaging more actively to improve the relationship through doing things like reinstating shuttle diplomacy between the leaders, as well as importantly enhance trilateral U.S. ROK Japan security cooperation as a means to counter North Korea as well as China. So those are kind of the broad differences between the candidates, again, putting meat on the bones of some of the things the earlier panelists have so eloquently stated. What are the implications of this? One's fairly clear. I think if the candidates govern as they have laid out the policy, if there's consistency in their policy positions once elected with their campaign positions, there's more likely to be greater friction or less friction points between the U.S. and South Korea under Yoon than Lee, because of Yoon's strong focus on alignment. So a fairly obvious point, perhaps, but one that bears repeating and thinking about in terms of implications for the United States. Even though both do support a strong alliance, and of course the United States will work with either leader. and work closely with either leader. But there is one caveat to this prediction, and it has to do with the unique nature of this election. With both of these main candidates, political outsiders that have little foreign policy experience, a lot of the campaign positions, I think, these kind of some of them very detailed positions have been laid out by very experienced foreign policy advisors on the two sides. Wee Sang-lak and Kim Sang-han, very well known, very experienced, knowledgeable experts on these things. So there's a question as to whether that these lines continue, on either side, when Yoon or Lee takes office, and that's going to be a question mark. In general, I think these broad brushstrokes will hold, but there could be some variation based on, again, the unique nature of these candidates in this election. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Katrin. So much to think about, and yeah, just great to think deeply about what the future might hold and how different a Yoon versus a Lee administration could potentially be when it comes to foreign policy. And we're going to proceed into the lightning round now. This is where we'll be a little bit looser and faster answers, more organic, and everyone will get a bite of the apple if they so choose to take such a bite. The first question flows from the last question about foreign policy, and this goes to the ripple effects from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I want to ask what this election is going to mean for Korea's ambitions to grow as a technological, economic, and diplomatic power in an era of increasing global divisiveness. And to what extent are Korea's foreign policy choices narrowing, and how can the next leadership seize the initiative? And just to tee us up a little bit on this question about where Korea is going to go in terms of foreign policy. Today, the Chinese foreign minister released a statement saying that the onus is on the United States to drive forward the inter-Korean process and the denuclearization diplomacy process, and also to characterize his relationship with South Korea, China's relationship with South Korea, as quote, friendly neighbors, end quote, that share long history, having proved to be partners for huge cooperation, not rivals. You can almost hear in that, by implication, a warning not to stray away from that, which is probably looks likely if Yoon takes up the next presidential administration. So I want to ask about, where we're going next. So this is open to everybody. Please go ahead and jump in. Who would like to go first? Katrin, take it away.
I'll take it, just not to hog the floor, but because it dovetails a bit on the foreign policy points, and then I'm really eager to hear from other panelists. I like how this question is framed, Jonathan, because to what extent are Korea's foreign policy choices narrowing because of the Ukraine situation, and I think that's exactly what is happening. It's narrowing South Korea's foreign policy choices. Specifically, it's made it more difficult for South Korea and others in the region to keep their heads down, to avoid choosing sides in this broader global struggle between forces seeking to uphold the rules-based order or undermine it. So as increasing numbers of countries in Europe and Asia unify behind actions to stand up to Russia's aggression, those that don't join the effort, and this is an obvious point for all of us, have been following so closely these unfolding dynamics, but those that don't join the effort, or do so minimally to avoid antagonizing Russia, will be more exposed than ever before. And so in effect, keeping your head down now gets you noticed. And that puts a lot more pressure on Korea than it's faced in the past, as well as other countries in the region. India is another one that comes up. So the costs of hedging, a kind of hedging strategy, have increased. It puts Seoul, that type of strategy will put Seoul outside this, whatever you want to call it, like-minded allied Western camp, defending the rules-based order, which is the company, of course, that Seoul would like to keep in the world and in the region. So it intensifies South Korea's pressure. We'll see what the next leader does under that pressure. But it will be important if that leader decides to kind of more firmly stand in one camp, that they make a clear case for why more decisive action than Seoul has taken so far is in the best interest of the country, even though it will involve economic costs. But that there's this larger issue of the rules-based order. These are nice phrases that we see thrown around, but to really this is not a substantive campaign, but in some ways maybe the moments will sober the minds and focus and bring out both more substantive debate as well as explanations for why certain actions might be necessary in this moment. And that's a long-winded answer. I'm eager to hear from others on the panel.
Yeah,
Great. I see Michelle.
Oh yeah, I'd like to jump in here too. And the difference in South Korea's or the way that South Korea has responded has been so telling, especially because I also cover Japan. And over the past week and a half or so, Japan's foreign policy has been incredibly assertive, and it's really set aside its own interest with Russia to make a statement at this moment on behalf of and alongside with the international community. And I think it was a big missed opportunity from South Korea's side in showing solidarity along with the international community on those very principles that you just mentioned, Katrin. I think U.S. ROK officials make a big deal about the alliance going beyond North Korea. Like we talked about the joint statement. We always go back to a joint statement to show that the alliance is so much more now. There's economic security, there's semiconductor supply chain management, vaccine distributions, et cetera. But in my view, over the past week and a half or so, I think you saw the limitations of South Korea's rhetoric and how far it is willing to go. And when push came to shove, Korea hesitated. It hedged out of concerns of China, North Korea, its own economy, whatever it is, it hasn't quite articulated, but it did hedge. And on LNG, SWIFT, export bans, all those sanctions, South Korea was several steps behind not only large economies, but its partners in the region, not just Japan, but Australia, even Singapore. I think whoever the next president is going to be is going to really need to contend with the fact that when the moment came that mattered, South Korea was not a vocal presence. And there will be questions about exactly what South Korea's commitments are compared to what its words are.
Really well put. Thank you, Michelle. And now over to Jeongmin.
I just want to say that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it seems that the international relations policy would be more difficult for Lee than Yoon. It's mostly because of how they were framing their stance when they are seeing the big power, a great power competition. Lee Jae-myung's one of the main mottos is a pragmatic diplomacy. This basically means that Lee is going for the policies, whichever way that benefits the national interest of South Korea. So he doesn't have a set value when he is approaching these issues, but he will make the decisions when it comes. But at these situations, South Korea faces the dilemma, the middle power or shrimp between the whales dilemma, where it's just time. They cannot afford sitting on the fence. They have to make their identity clear at these moments of who South Korea is pledging solidarity with, what kind of value they are standing up for. But then South Korea is so dependent on many different countries, so it's really difficult for them to make a clear decision right away, it seems, for the Blue House right now. It's similar to Lee, but Yoon, it seems that it's a little bit more easier for him probably to handle this type of situation, because Yoon's value priorities are very clear. Yoon wants South Korea to be a quote unquote global pivotal state, which means that it is pledging solidarity with the countries that share the same democratic values, a liberal democracy, the idea of freedom, and against human. He's also very he voices against any types of human rights infringement in other countries, which some people were hesitant when they were mentioning issues such as China or North Korea. So all in all, it seems that after the Ukraine situation, whoever comes into the Blue House, it will be difficult. But my understanding is that it will be even more difficult to lead than you.
Thanks very much, Jeongmin. Very well stated. And Karl, I'll give you a shot here if you want to take a crack.
I'll be very brief, since I think all the major points have been so well put. But yeah, I really like Michelle's point of how the actions and the words often don't match, and this is going to be a real test for South Korea moving forward. As much as we were talking recently about Europe entering a new era, it also feels like a new era for Korea. And you go back to the very first statement, at least the first statement that I read when the sanctions were coming up was, a statement I think out of someone at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that Korea had no other choice, right, but to follow the international sanctions. I mean, a very weak statement, almost seeming to suggest that, well, they would prefer not to. And of course, they would prefer not to, right? They're looking to protect their economy. They don't want to ruffle any feathers. And I think that time of keeping their head down, as Katrin, I think, put it, is gone. And so this shrinking space for words and actions and how Korea can maneuver is going to be difficult. And I really like Jeongmin's point as well about this is going to be more difficult for Lee Jae-myung with his pragmatism. So perhaps it'll be easier for Yoon. I do suspect that he'll still find it more difficult when someone lays out the economic consequences for doing that. But yeah, I think it will be more difficult for Lee Jae-myung as well.
Thank you very much, Karl. Okay, so now moving on from the foreign policy realm to more of the domestic space. This is Korea's 8th democratic election. As we've seen, this has been a pretty bruising and personal campaign season. But beyond that, there really is a choice here between two very different policy platforms. So I want to ask what this election means in terms of the continuing development of South Korea's democracy. And I'll tack on a question that we got here from our audience member, Jared Sandler from Gimcheon University. He just notes that both of these candidates are unpopular. And why is that the case? And what does it mean? Karl, yeah.
Can I take the second part of that question? I'll leave the first part for someone else if they like to. But yeah, this idea of the unpopular candidates. Part of this is I don't think it's a problem with the democratic structure, but more about just a confluence of events in some ways, right? That the conservatives were essentially wiped out by the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. Even at the time that happened, we were all looking around saying, who's going to take over for the conservatives? There was no obvious candidate. And that was, 5 years ago at this point, and still no one has emerged. And that lack of conservative leadership was then only kind of made more severe when they got wiped out again in the 2020 National Assembly elections. So there was really no one to step up to take this conservative mantle. In the primary, Hong Joon-pyo actually beat Yoon Suk-yeol in the public opinion poll section of the primary, but he didn't have the party backing and was essentially defeated based on that. But, Hong Joon-pyo has been around a long time. He's not a new face whatsoever. In the last election, he was defeated quite easily by Moon Jae-in. So I don't think there was any appetite from the conservatives to have a repeat of that. And so we end up with kind of this political outsider getting involved in his first election. And in some ways, the story is somewhat the same on the progressive side. Right? I think if there is another criticism to be leveled at the Moon administration, or perhaps Moon as himself as president, is that he didn't really line up a successor. There was no one there that was kind of painted to take over this role. And except for, someone in 2016, 2017, who was seen as kind of a rising star, and that was An Hee-jung. But then in 2019, he was convicted of raping his assistant. He's currently in prison. And then again, there's no one really to step up on the progressive side who seems like a natural candidate. So it's kind of a confluence, in my view, of very thin benches from both parties, and then also aligning with kind of the social kind of cries for blood to seek punishment for their rivals.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Karl. Any more thoughts on that one?
Just going to briefly add that, I'm just going to briefly add that the birth of a presidential candidate, Yoon Suk-yeol, is a very interesting phenomenon in South Korea under the situation that Karl just explained. Yoon was someone who was hired by a Democratic Party Moon administration, and he took part in a very major way in impeaching former President Park Geun-hye. But because the entire conservative narrative on the next presidential election depended on this idea of punishing and trying the Moon administration, Yoon was a perfect person for them to set up as a new leader based on this hatred towards Moon, because Yoon is someone who left the administration after some tug of war with the Moon administration officials, after a lot of controversies happening under Moon with the issue of the personnel. So it's just a very telling phenomena that Yoon is the leading candidate of the party.
Really interesting. Thank you. Well stated, Jeongmin. Any more before we move on to economics? Katrin.
Yeah, I would just jump in. The great points already been made, but just broadly speaking, unfortunately, this election, as Michelle and Karl and others have talked about, has been notable more for the risks it entails to democratic backsliding than advancement. And as others have noted as well, it's been in a lot of commentaries, populism and the increasing divides at both the elite levels as well as the general public levels that have gone along with it are really at the heart of it. This is kind of going into a different topic here, but it's taken a particularly toxic form in many different divides, right? But in the feminism versus anti-feminism divide that the Yoon campaign in particular has stoked to gain votes, though both camps are going for the so-called, male vote. These types of divisions are, a dead end for Korea. I mean, where do you go when you're pitting women against men in a society? It's a dead end for any society. Focusing more on stoking grievances than advancing clear and effective policy options to address urgent economic and societal challenges. Of course, this is something the United States unfortunately knows very well, right? And is stuck in this moment too. It's very disheartening, though also something we can relate to hear Karl talk about, polarization is not a big concern. It sounds like a lot like the United States. What does it mean for South Korean democracy? It will be difficult, if not impossible, to address deep-seated societal problems for as long as the focus is on, personalities and grievances rather than substance and future-oriented policies and visions. One possibly optimistic scenario, I guess, to throw it out there is, with the youth vote, which is critical in this election. This generation is more pragmatic, less ideological than its predecessors. It's also the group hardest hit by the housing and unemployment problems. So, right now it's being kind of played with a bit in these divides. But if this group does decide to deliver the message, that grievance-driven politics won't win votes, there may be a hope for a populist U-turn. Certainly not by Wednesday, but on the horizon. So I'm putting my hope in the youth of South Korea.
Thanks so much, Katrin. Well stated. Okay, so let's move on to economics, an issue that matters to the youth, but also to everybody. So Korea has the 10th largest economy in the world. It leads, of course, in a number of cutting-edge technologies, and it is a manufacturing powerhouse. But it also has some struggles right now. Real estate prices are extremely high. Household debt is also very high. 9% of the youth are unemployed, and wage inequality is growing. So how are these candidates handling economics differently, and where do you see us going in the road ahead? Any thoughts on this one? Katrin,
I'll jump in and I'll be brief just to kick it off. I'll just kind of say through a foreign policy lens, it's ironic and tragic that South Korea is gaining international prominence, as never before. Just as faith in Koreans have in their own system to be able to provide for their citizens is dwindling. So, South Korea is essentially getting famous while its own people lose hope. I mean, that's reflected very much in the blockbuster Netflix series and the movies that have made South Korea famous. So there's a lot of deep irony in that. So in foreign policy, this has implications for South Korea's ability to step up in the world as a leading democracy, as the U.S. very much hopes it'll do. But as the U.S. also knows painfully in this moment, it's difficult to promote democracy abroad when your own democracy is perceived as not delivering at home. So I'm kind of maybe stating a fairly obvious problem. The candidates have come up with plans to address these important problems, with the Lee camp focused more on government-led solutions and the Yoon camp focused on market-led policies. But to the points that were made, earlier by other panelists, nobody really seems to believe that these candidates have it in them, or really even maybe have deep-seated expertise needed to make these policies effective. I'm not ending with optimism again, but I'm just saying, like, I think that this global crisis might be sobering, as I noted before, and perhaps focus the minds on these important issues, both for domestic and foreign policy reasons.
Thank you, Katrin. So well stated. And yeah, Karl, over to you.
Yeah, so, on the real estate side, I can remember being in DC in 2009 at a conference. And even at that time, there was discussion about a housing bubble in Korea. So this discussion in real estate has been going on for well more than a decade. And when you look at the candidates' kind of proposals, there's basically, they're fairly close, right? It's build more houses, provide more houses for cheaper prices, and make sure that younger people have better access to housing. There's a pretty significant difference on how they want to tax people. With Lee Jae-myung, I think, wanting to tax land ownership and then using some of that revenue stream to then provide for universal basic income. And then I think Yoon taking the approach of lowering taxes so that there will be more transactions and let the market sort it out. But I think the real estate problem is really intractable, because I don't see a great incentive for any of the presidents to really get involved and really try to solve the problem. Because no one wants it on their head. If this problem has been brewing for more than a decade, no one wants it on their presidency that they were the one who pushed in the final card and caused any kind of collapse that would then lead to bigger issues. You talked about the household debt. Of course, credit rates have been relatively low for an extended period of time. I think the Bank of Korea has been fairly aggressive about pushing the credit rate up. And so I was wondering if we were going to start getting to a point where, of course, people under household debt, if they were going to start to feel a bit of the pressure. And in some ways, I wonder if now this one of the unforeseen outcomes of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that those credit hikes might start to ease off a bit because of the uncertainty. So the incoming president might have a little more of a lead time to put policies in place, rather than immediately finding out that consumers and borrowers are now under household debt and under pressure from increasing credit hikes.
Thanks so much, Karl. And yeah, just to mention that Thomas Yu from Willow River Capital Management LLC was also wondering about this question. So just wanted to mention him as we answer it. And I know that Jeongmin has some thoughts to add as well. So over to you, Jeong.
Thank you. The real estate issues, unemployment, wage gap, these economic issues. Aside from how actually serious these problems are, I think it's also another matter on why this became such an issue during this election, especially related to the presidential candidate's own mudslinging and scandals as well. So there were a lot of attention on the candidates' families, of their spouses, their kids, and all of these issues about inequality between the elites and the non-elites. It came after the Chogung incident under the Moon administration, and it just kept continuing, and even started before then. And it was just a brewing hotspot where people were having this ongoing complaints about the people who were holding public offices, that they're not being transparent, that they were, and there was a lot of, I see just a lot of political indifference towards whichever candidate, that they just don't trust in the public officials anymore, especially when it comes to economic policies, which whatever their policies are, they don't see the elites as actually understanding what's going on in the country. And regardless of which camp they are in, it seems the overall sentiment right now is that they are feeling betrayed. So whoever comes into the Blue House, it will be such a challenge for them to resolve this issue about the losing, the loss of trust from the public to the public officers.
Thank you, Jeongmin. Really well stated. Michelle, I saw you take yourself off mute. Do you want to jump in as well?
Just a really quick thought that occurred to me as Jeongmin was talking is that Lee Jae-myung, it's probably going to be extra harder for him to overcome this trust issue on real estate development, given his own scandal with the Daejangdong project and the fact that he is kind of, the scandal that's really bedeviling his campaign is his role in this major real estate development project in Gyeonggi. And I think when it comes to trust and the role that people see of his leadership in tackling systemic real estate issues, that might be an added challenge for his administration if he does become president.
Absolutely. Well stated. Okay, so we've covered economics, foreign policy, the state of Korea's democracy and its democratic institutions. Last but certainly not least, I want to talk about cultural issues. So we've mentioned so far feminism, anti-feminism, gender roles, young people, minorities, but I want to get into it a little bit more explicitly here. Michelle, you recently wrote an article about this. So I was hoping that you could kick us off. And just to mention that Lydia Toledo from Columbia University and Edward Baker from Harvard University both asked about the gender role dynamic. So this is also answering their questions as well.
Yeah, well, this is such a key issue, this election. I mean, to the extent that issues are driving the campaigns, especially based on this prediction that young people in their 20s are going to be a potential swing bloc. And there's been a tension on this gender issue because it has become such a divisive issue for people in their 20s. I recently wrote about kind of the evolution of the modern day feminist movement in South Korea and how a really pivotal moment was 2016 during the brutal stabbing of a young woman in her 20s by a man in his 30s at the Gangnam subway station. And the man said that he murdered her because he was angry that women don't pay attention to him and they seem to ignore him. And that really just triggered this reckoning of the real vulnerability of South Korean women and the sexual violence that they face. And then after that, you saw these other movements that were pro-women's rights, like the Me Too movement, Escape the Corset movement, which was rejecting K-beauty standards. But all along the way, an anti-feminist movement was festering right alongside it. And it was really cultivated in these online forums, private Discord channels that were only men and men who felt disdainful toward the women. But now it's erupted to this point where it's become talking points in the presidential election. These anti-feminist sentiments among men in their 20s, it's just become so toxic and it's permeated throughout society, throughout so many groups in these men in their 20s. And it's almost become a fad. I mean, the facts are that the unemployment rate is lower for women in their 20s compared to men in their 20s. And women have higher college acceptance rates than men do, that their male peers do. And so for these men, it really feels like the women already have rights, and that feminism is just this clarion call for mistreating men, and that they don't actually need extra gender rights to be equal in society. They feel discriminated against because of this, these policies that are meant to make society equal for women. But also that overlooks the fact that workforce participation among women in their 30s and 40s plummets once they're expected to have kids, once they're expected to be at home. There's a huge gender pay disparity for women. They make less than men. Women are missing in positions of power in both the professional and public sectors, and South Korea ranks last among developed countries when it comes to working environments for women. And the women who do stay in the workforce face harassment, they face limited opportunities of moving up, and they face real difficulties balancing work and childcare. And we've seen the Yoon campaign kind of appeal to the men who do feel frustrated by the Moon government, the self-professed feminist president Moon, and his efforts to close the gender disparity, and Lee campaign making a shift toward women, the young women in recent weeks. And we'll have to see how the actual voters turn out. But it also makes me, wonder if either of the candidates will, because this is such a divisive issue and the candidates are so tied, I think that if the Lee campaign wins, it'll embolden the anti-feminist men even more. I think if Yoon wins, it will still embolden the anti-feminist men even more, and it will stay an issue regardless of who becomes president. And I see this just becoming an issue moving forward.
Thank you, Michelle. So well stated. And yeah, a really important issue in this election and going forward. And Jeongmin, I know you have some thoughts to add as well.
Just briefly, I am a South Korean voter, young woman in her 20s living in South Korea. So this issue is very real to me. I have to live through this every single day, talking to my peers who are in their 20s. And the hatred is real. And it seems that although that the Lee campaign has pivoted to the women voters in recent weeks, especially after the final presidential televised debate where the topic was on social issues, where they mentioned the issue of feminism, Lee did pivot to the women voters, but I'll say it's just too little too late. I think because there are a lot of reports about how the young women voters are the casting vote, it seems that they are pushing especially more attention to punching out these policies and Facebook posts and how they will become, both of them will become a president that makes South Korea into a safer place for women. But I say that it's too late. The women voters here are already disillusioned from the entire election period where they were persuading the male voters that they will become the president who listens to their concerns about what's happening in South Korea. And Yoon's remark about how there is no structural inequality, gender inequality in South Korea is very telling where he stands on. And during the presidential candidate, the official televised debate, Yoon was saying that feminism is one part of humanism, where Lee attacked Yoon for explaining what the actual definition of feminism is. It looked like he already prepared for that. He knows that the young women voters are the ones who does not want to vote for Yoon. But seeing this from zooming out a little bit, this issue, whether or not they are explaining feminism or gender issues in a more accurate way, they are still using that as a peg to the election. They are essentially saying all this during the hot time, during the end of the election period. And after the election ends, when they become the presidents, like Michelle says, it's unclear where the society will be headed to, because there's a lot of hatred in the society right now, and both candidates are using it.
Thank you very much, Jeongmin. And any more thoughts on that one before we go to our last two audience questions? Okay, so let's go now to a pair of questions that talk about foreign policy and where we're headed in the next 5 years under the next administration. So one concerns, will Korea join the Quad? And the other question concerns, will Korea follow Germany's model? I think Germany followed Korea's model in increasing its defense spending and becoming a little bit more active in the region. But this is a way of asking, will Korea look at what's happening in the region and in the world and devote more resources into its defense capacity and double down on the alliance, go more towards autonomy? Where's it going in the road ahead? We touched on this a little bit, but this is worth drilling down a little bit further. So the question about should Korea follow Germany's example comes from Marie Uchima from Stanford University. And then the question about whether Korea should join the Quad or not comes from Johannes Allefelt. So the Quad and will Korea increase defense spending? Katrin.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that question and also address the OPCON, the earlier question from, I believe, Mr. Fraser. I wouldn't forget that name. Yeah, so in terms of military capabilities, OPCON, where these candidates are headed, both sides want to strengthen South Korea's military capabilities, but for different reasons. I want to kind of plug, I believe it's Lami Kim's great piece on this recently, War on the Rocks, and did a podcast on it. Fantastic coverage of this issue. And I'll kind of, reflect on that. Basically on the left, it's more to prepare South Korea, for a more autonomous, capability to prepare for OPCON transition as early as possible. Candidate Lee seeks to build as noted, nuclear power submarines, speed up the development of indigenous long-range surface-to-air missiles, rather than purchasing THAAD batteries from Washington. So, building up military capabilities, which can be quite confusing. What about, getting along with North Korea, but really to give South Korea a more autonomous role. On the right, the buildup would be more to enhance capabilities together with the United States to deter North Korean aggression. Yoon dubs his policy peace through strength, focusing on reinforcing South Korea-US combined defense posture and extended deterrence. In terms of statements, you'll find both candidates, supporting, I'm going back to the joint statement I referenced earlier, supporting, many of the same things. But again, it's important, I think, to dig into why and what the kind of lineage is there. And that has implications in terms of things like OPCON. I think generally this is a pattern that we kind of know well from recent administrations, that there's more, on the progressive side, more a sense that they want it to happen sooner than later. Hence, again, the military capability built up, the indigenous one on South Korean side. Conservatives are more in line with a conditions-based approach, not in as much of a rush, and working, lockstep with the United States. So I hope that covers those questions. Again, one other note, we might also see continued discussion of the end of war declaration, as has been noted by other panelists previously under a Lee administration, less so under Yoon. Though symbolic, this declaration can also have impact on military readiness and erosion as people begin to question the purpose and value of U.S. troops on the peninsula under, so-called peace, right? So that's an ongoing issue under Lee, and I'll end there.
Excellent. Michelle.
Yeah, I'll just speak briefly on the Quad component. I think we all kind of touched on this earlier, but I believe Yoon Suk-yeol is more. Lee's campaign has said they would want to cooperate with Quad, but Yoon is probably more likely to try to join if they actually wanted to. I mean, the People Power Party's chairman Lee Jun-seok himself is very vocal about actually wanting to join the Quad. I think the real question is whether the Quad would want South Korea. And especially now after Russia, and what we already talked about with South Korea's response to Russia. I mean, just look at India. It's already emerged as such a clear weak link within the Quad grouping when it comes to a response to a situation like this, where Russia is clearly violating, the international rules of order. And that's the whole reason why the rules-based order, which is the whole reason why the Quad got together in the first place with an eye toward China. And I think the Quad itself might be going through a bit of an identity crisis after the past 2 weeks or so. And as we discussed about, South Korea's lukewarm response during this moment when the entire international community, except a handful of countries, are on the side of a rules-based order. If Quad would consider expanding given its current grouping, and whether that expansion would obviously be an inclusion of South Korea.
Really well stated. Thank you very much, Michelle. And just in terms of India, it makes us ask whether policy preferences of given countries are going to vary regionally. So can India do one thing when it comes to its relations with Russia and then act another way in the Pacific? So there's a lot of countries that have that same orientation where the policy preferences depend on the region and the partner and adversary in question. Karl, I wanted to get to you, see if you had any thoughts on this one. And then the last question is going to be, is anyone willing to go on record with a prediction that comes from Tammy Overby? She's a board director here at the Korea Society. So Karl, over to you. And then if anyone's brave enough to make their prediction.
So I'm already thinking about that last question and don't want to answer it, but I'll maybe give it a try after some thought. But I just wanted to quickly note, one of the things that Jeongmin said earlier, she alluded to this, the Yoon camp being more willing to identify North Korea as the main enemy, right? And that's one of the key terms that will come out and kind of guides defense spending. So I fully expect no matter who is going to be in the Blue House, that defense spending is going to continue to increase, but they're going to spend on different assets. Right. Yeah. So if it's the conservatives, and I think Katrin was talking about this, if it's the conservatives, they're going to identify Korea as the main enemy, or North Korea as the main enemy. And then that means defense spending is going to flow into the Army and the Air Force. Whereas for the progressives, when they delist North Korea as the main enemy, then we see spending on naval assets. And I think there's a dichotomy, at least in the United States, where we tend to think that conservative spending on defense is good, and progressives are their spending is on things for autonomy. But I hope we can get to a place where we tend to think about that the fact that South Korea's spending on naval assets is also good for the alliance, especially in the longer term. So they do it at different times, and we would like them to integrate it a little bit more. But both of those things, I think, serve the alliance in the long term.
Well stated. Yeah, that's important. Okay, now it is time. Is anyone brave enough to go public with their prediction for what this election is going to show us? No.
No.
No. Okay. Well, that answers the question. Thank you so much to our panelists. We really, really appreciate your time and expertise. I've learned so much here today, and even just doing lots of preparation in order to get the right questions and reading what you've prepared. I've still learned so much today. So we really, really do appreciate you. Michelle, Karl, Jeongmin, Katrin, it's such a pleasure. And just to tip off our audience about things that are coming up on Friday, March 18th, we're going to have an interview with our president, Tom Byrne, and the Korean Minister for Trade, Yo Kon-hoo. So that is going to be a live webcast and a limited in-person audience as well. And then on March 31st, we have a live webcast and an in-person audience, Pyeonghattan, that's going to feature So-hyun Lee and Hyun-sung Lee, a pair of escapee siblings that left China. Their father worked for Office 38. And also Hannah Song from Link. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation, and I hope that you'll be able to join us from that. To our virtual audience who tuned in today, thank you so much. Tom Byrne, thank you for a great introduction. Irene Kyung, running everything behind the scenes, our policy associate, thank you so much. Peter Stumke, doing so much to help us with all of the video, setting everything up on the technology side. Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great day, and time will tell where this election goes.